Today we're reading from the Srimad Bhagavatam, Canto 3, Chapter 5, Vidura's Talks with Maitreya. And that's Chapter 5. We're taking up at text number 30. The false ego is transformed into mind by interaction with the mode of goodness. All the demigods who control the phenomenal world are also products of the same principle, namely the interaction of false ego and the mode of goodness. Purport. False ego interacting with the different modes of material nature is a source of all materials in the phenomenal world. We say the Mangalacharana together. Om Jnana Timirandasya Jnananjana Shalakaya Chakshurun Militam Nena Tasmai Shri Gurave Namaha Shri Chaitanya Manobhishtam Stapitam Yena Bhutale Swayam Rupa Katamayam Dadati Swapadantikam Vandeham Shri Guru Sri Uta Padakamalam Shri Gurun Vaishnavam Cha Shri Rupam Sagrajatam Sahagana Raghunatham Vitam Tam Sajivam Sadvaitam Sadvatutam Parijana Sahitam Krishna Chaitanya Devam Shri Radha Krishna Pada Sahagana Lalita Shri Vishakanvitamscha Hey Krishna Karuna Sindho Dinabandho Jagatpate Gopesha Gopika Kanta Radha Kanta Namostute Tapta Kanchana Gaurangi Radhe Vrindavaneshwari Rishabhanu Sute Devi Pranamami Hari Priye Vansha Kalpatarubhyascha Kripa Sindhubhya Evacha Patitanam Bhavanebhyo Vaishnavebhyo Namo Namaha Jaya Shri Krishna Chaitanya Prabhu Nityananda Shri Advaita Gadadhara Shivasadi Gaura Bhaktavinda Hare Krishna 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 Hare 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 Rama 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 Hare Hare Aham Tattvad Vikurvanam Mano Vaikarikad Abhut Vaikarikash Chaye Deva Arta Bhivyatnyanam Yataha. The false ego is transformed into mind by interaction with the mode of goodness. All the demigods who control the phenomenal world are all products of the same principle, namely the interaction of false ego and the mode of goodness. It's helpful to give context to this verse because there are those who practice Sankhya yoga in which they categorize the elements of the material nature in order to distinguish themselves from the various elements. Ordinarily not an easy task, as Devahuti mentions to Kapiladev when she says it seems as though I am part of the material nature and the mind constantly coaxes me to take advantage of the so-called pleasures of the material world, and there's no end to it. However, those who simply analyze the material elements without coming to the point of understanding where they come from, what their purpose is, and who's behind it all, and what our relationship is with the person who's behind it all, are left wanting. In fact, they can't attain anything which is sustainable. Aruya Krishna Paramparam Tata Patantyato Nadrita Yushmarangraya. Those who have an incomplete understanding of the complete whole, which is comprised, it's Advaya Gyan Tattva, but Vedanti Tattva Vidas Tattvam Yajganamadvayam Brahmeti Paramatmeti Bhagavan iti Shabdite. And at the outset of the Srimad Bhagavatam, first canto, second chapter, we hear that the direct means for coming to complete knowledge of the complete whole, besides processes like yoga, jnana, sankhya, is Vedanti tattvavidas tattvam yajnanam advayam, Vasudeve Bhagavati Bhakti Yoga Prayojita Janaya Yashu Vairagyam Jnanam Chayarahaitukam. Bhagavatam goes straight to the cure before going into all the details, just to give a preamble that this is where we're going. That if you directly worship the Supreme Personality of Godhead through the process of devotional service, then the concomitants of that are jnana, which means the knowledge of the difference between matter and spirit, as Krishna says in the Bhagavad Gita, Kshetra Jnam Chapimam Vidhi Sarva Kshetrishu Bharata Kshetra Gyoro Jnanam Yatach Jnanam Yatam Mama. My assessment, Krishna says, is the quality of knowledge. Basic, foundational aspect is the soul being able to see the difference between himself and matter. And in this section, we are hearing a discussion between Vidura and Maitreya. And the ultimate goal of Vidura is to hear Krishna Katha, the topics of Krishna. That's stated in the earlier verses. He's eager for that, but he's starting at the beginning to give context that what is the entanglement of a living entity in the material world and where does it come from? Understanding the energies of the Lord and how they're manifest in this world is one of the main topics of any Purana, and the Srimad Bhagavatam follows that system also. So here we hear Aham Tattvad. So Tattvad, from the principle of false ego, the word Tattva is being here rendered as, or translated by Prabhupada as, a principle. Tat means, it's a demonstrative pronoun. It means something you can point to as categorical and say that it exists. It has its own characteristic. And one of the tattvas, or those characteristics of the material world, which is what's being described here, the unfoldment of the Mahatattva into varieties. And that those main categories in the Mahatattva are Sattva, Rajas, and Tamas. They have creative power. And here, from the principle of false ego, vikurvanat, there's a transformation. This starts, as described early in the Bhagavatam, that gives, in the second chapter, again, Divinity and Divine Service, a summary of how creation unfolds in the material world and who starts it. That's the most important part. As there's a way in which, once we're ensconced in the material energy, it's hard to see where we came from. Narupam asyeha tato palabhyate nanto nachadir natasam pratishta ashvatamenam savaruda mulung masanga shastrena tritena chitva. Therefore, Krishna says in the Bhagavad Gita, you can't see its form. You don't know the form of the material world. Narupam asyeha tato apalabhyate nanto. You can't see where it begins or ends. Nanto nachadir dachasam pratishta. You can't even see where you're standing. Ashvatamenam, so he compares it to an ashvata, a banyan tree. Ashvatamenam suvaruda mulam, and it's deeply rooted. Asanga shastrena dridhena chitva. So you have to have a means to cut down this tree. It's called asanga, or non-attachment to the material world, which then is implied in the second part of the verse, tatakpadam tat parimargitavyam yasmin gata nanyavatanti bhuya tameva chadyam purusham prapadye yatak praviti prashita purani, which means that you should have your attention pointed towards the origin of it all. Again, it's pointing tat. Where do you go once you cut down this tree, this amorphous tree where you don't know, you don't have any know your bearings in this tree? But he says, by the power of the Shastra and by knowledge, you can cut down this tree, and by good association. And then tatakparam tat, now you can point towards the original cause of everything, as in Om Tad Vishnu Paramam Padam Sada Pashanti Suryaho Diviva Chaksha Tatam Tabipraso Vipanyavo Jagrapam Sahasaminta Te Vishnu Yat Paramam Padam. Those who are able to do this through the process of devotional service, although standing in this world, they have their attention pointed towards Tat, Om Tad Vishnu Paramam Padam, the supreme abode of Vishnu and Vishnu himself. And in the Divinity and Divine Service, we have a description in 4 verses, starting with number 30. How does that start? Sa evedam sasarja gre bhagavan atmamaya sadasad rupaya chaso gunamaya guno vibhu. So this verse, sa evedam sasarja gre, it's talking about the process of creation as being described here. Sa evedam sasajagre bhagavan atmamaya. How is the creation taking place? And Prabhupada dedicates, I think, one of the longest, if not the longest, purport in all of his books in the Adi Lila Chaitanya Charitamrita, describing Sankarshana, who he is and how the living entities are. He's the reservoir of all the jivas, and how the material world is created. What is the cause of the material creation? And I'll just give you a brief conclusion of that very long paragraph. It doesn't come from nothing. That's a logical fallacy, that something comes from nothing. And so Prabhupada spends about 15 pages describing in various ways how it's not possible for something to come from nothing. There is someone there, and that there's something coming from him. Sa evidam sasadra Bhagavan Atmamaya. It's Bhagavan. It's the supreme absolute truth, the source of everything, and it's Atmamaya. It's his energies that are, through which he transforms the Mahatattva, the material world, and it goes into varieties, which we're in the midst of that now. He's just describing how one of the elements of the Lord's creation, the Sattva gun, which has the potency for knowledge and equilibrium, is manifesting the mind and also the devas. Sa evidam sasadragre bhagavan atmamaya sadasad rupaya chaso gunamaya guno vibhu. So it goes on, the summary by Sutta Goswami, who's saying sadasad, the cause and effect, there's an ingredient cause and efficient cause. The ingredient cause is the elements of the material world, which start off as pradana, and then sadasad, then by the glance of the Supreme Lord, as described in the Brahma Samhita, Atmana Mayaya Ramamanasya Naviyogas Tayasaha Atmana Ramaya Remi Tyakvakalam Shashikshaya. He says Brahma, that Mayaya Ramamanasya, Aramamanasya means that the Lord doesn't have really any connection to the material world. Atmana Ramamanasya Naviyogas. But viyoga means completely cut off, like yoga means connection, and viyoga means It's not connected to na-viyogaha, but at the same time, he's not completely separated from the material world. Na-viyogas tayasaha, atmana ramaya reme tekvakalam shikshaya. How does he stimulate the external feature of his energy, which is his binna prakriti, separated from? How does he stimulate that? He glances at it. We know that also from the Bhagavad Gita, mayadhyakshena prakriti. He says it's his eyes. What's in a glance anyway? Anywhere you look, even as living entities, we have some, like if you look at somebody right now, they're like, stop looking at me. Or if you're driving on the M25 and you lean over and look at somebody, they'll try to run you off the road. Because our glance has some power. What to speak of Mahavishnu? When he looks at the material energy, then everything starts to take place. But how does it take place? How does he have connection but non-connection at the same time? Mayaya ramamanasya naviyogas tayasaha atmana ramaya remi. Rama Devi is the consort of the Lord. It's his Yogamaya potency. He never touches the external energy. He employs his internal energy, which then is a conduit. And his glance takes a form of Shambhu, which is the personification of the effulgence of the Lord's glance. As it goes to the material world, Rama Devi, as a servant of the Lord, accompanies Shambhu. She's an expansion of the Lord, as all energies are. And when reaching the material world, Rama Devi expands to be become the consort of Shambhu. So you find that the emblem of the material world, or the emblems, are the yoni and the lingam. So Shiva is Shiram yatara vikara vishesha yogat sanjayate nahitata pratagasti heto shambhutam apitata yashambhutam apitata samuphaiti karayat govindamadi purusham tamahamaja. If you take yogurt, if you take milk and it's touched by acid, it transforms. So Shiva, Shambhu, is the personality of Godhead, only that aspect that has connection to the material world. But the Lord himself doesn't have any direct connection. Maya ya Rama Manasya, no direct connection. Naviyogas taya, but not no connection. His connection comes through his expansion of his glance into the material world, which also carries the time energy that stimulates the activity of the living entities in the material world. Continuing in the summary that's given in the Divinity and Divine Service. What is it? Taya vilashitesheshu guneshu gunavaniva antak pravishta abhati vijnanena vrajimbrita. So this gives a similar idea that the Lord never has anything to do with the material energy. He's always in his transcendental position. And then the next verse gives an example. Yata yavahito vanir darushve kasva yonishu nani vapati vishvatma bhuteshu cha tata puman. Sutta Goswami is saying that the Lord, although he has nothing to do with the material nature, he enters it as the supersoul, as the suhrit, or the friend of all living entities. Ekopyasari charitum jagaranda kotim yach shakti rasti jagaranda chayayaranta andantarasta paramanu chayantarastam govindamari purusham tamaham bhajami. Brahma confirms in his Samhita that he expands himself into every atom, and there he is within the heart of every living being to oversee the activities of the Lord. And getting back to much of the point of today's verse is the next summary verse in the Divinity and Divine Service, which says, Asao gunamayir bhaver bhuta sukshmendriyam mabi swanirmiteshu nirvishto bhunte bhuteshu tadgunan. Asao means that Lord. Asao gunamayir bhaver ebi Asao gunamayir bhuta sukshmendriyam mabi. So what's happening is, because of a perverted desire to enjoy separately from the Lord, the all-accommodating potency, the Lord's expanding and accommodating potency in the form of the material world. And asal gunamaya bhuta sukshmendrayamabi, he enters the hearts of every living being, and he gives remembrance of the living entity's desire, and then he empowers the various modes of nature to assist the living entity in this virtual experience of the material world. You get 8,400,000 free rides you can go on to see if you can get a little something out of the material nature, which you can't. But he offers that facility for all living entities. Bhuta sukshendriyatma biswa nirmiteshu nirvishto bhunkte bhuteshu tadgunan. And he does it by empowering the modes of material nature. So that's what's being described here. Aham tattva vikurvanam. He, the Lord, uses the three modes of material nature to divide the nondescript pradhan, the mahat tattva, into various entities. And by entities, there's a hierarchy Krishna mentions in the 3rd chapter of the Gita near the end, when he says, what's the verse? The hierarchy. Indriyana prayanyahur indriyepya paramanaha manasastu parabhutir yo bhute paratastu saha. Lowest of all are the senses. And above the senses is the mind, above the mind is the intellect. And above the intellect is the soul. And of course above the soul is the super soul. And we'll find in subsequent verses that the Lord's using the modes of material nature as he transforms them, and the subtle energies of the Lord become grossified in the material world as facilitators of the living entity's desire to enjoy the material world. So you basically get your, what is it, little helmet you put on with your goggles, right? Is that how virtual reality? I've never done it, but you put on a little mask and you get some tactile sense, so you can touch an apparent world. It's not really there. It's illusory. But you think you're interacting with, but it's through the nexus of the false ego, which is that little cord that connects you to the machine that makes you think you're interacting in the material world, which Krishna describes. And I'll stop in a second here. In the 15th chapter of the Bhagavad Gita, he says, Shotram chakshu sparshanam cha rasanam granam eva cha adishtanam manaschaiva. Shotram chakshu sparshanam cha rasanam granam eva cha adishtayam manaschayam vishayan upasevate. He says, according to the desire of the living entity from the last life, or the life, even if it was the last life before all the living beings were absorbed back into Mahavishnu and they come back out again, then exactly in the way that the living entity had developed his or her consciousness, then through the accommodating potency, through these modalities, he's instrumental in giving them a perfect virtual reality set. Shotram, chakshu, sparshanam, cha, rasanam, granam, eva, cha. These are all the senses. And the senses are meant specifically to interact with specific objects in the material world. And in fact, as Hamsa Avatar describes in the 11th canto, when we come into the world, each one of our senses already has its counterpart. And for instance, pigs like stuff that we don't like. And I won't go into detail. But they just like it. Why? Because their senses are already connected. In fact, he does Hamsa Avatar, the word embedded. The sense objects are embedded within the mind, and the mind is then embedded within the sense object. So it's natural, once the senses manifest in this material world, that pigs like stuff. And then every entity, like the sea cow, likes other sea cows. And pumsastriya maituni bhava metam tayomritu hridaya grantamahu ato. Well, forget the last part, but there's a way in which everyone has their counterpart in this material world, and that's because of the arrangement of material nature. Why? Because you wanted it, and therefore it's being facilitated. So one of the points here, why is this important? Why is this context important? It's because then we can change that. That can be reformed. The desire is reformed by bhakti. And if you hear about our non-relationship with the material world, and it starts to make sense, and no wonder I'm always frustrated. And then you hear about the solution to takparam tat, parimargitavyam, that there's a supreme abode and we have a relationship with the personality of Godhead. And also, as I hopefully purposefully quoted, pumsastriya maitunibhavametam, the driving force in the material world is the sex energy, that one female is attracted to male and vice versa, but that's coming from the spiritual world. There's the Adi Ras, or the attraction between Radha and Krishna. And this material world is just the perverted reflection of the spiritual world. So when we start to transfer our attention from the material world, where we just get faked out, like Prahlad Maharaj says, Kutrasrisha Shruti Sukham Mrigatrishni Rupa Kvedam Kalevaram Ashesha Rajam Viroha. He said the whole material world is a mirage. Mrigatrishni Rupa, like a deer sees water in the desert where there isn't any, and chases after it and then dies trying. Sound familiar? That's the whole material creation. Drink this, do that, get sick, get well, hang around an inkwell. All these kind of ideas everybody has going on in the material world, but they never actually get there, he says. Shruti Sukham. You hear about it, it stimulates the idea that I could enjoy, but it's only by hearing about it. But when you hear Krishna Katha, which is what we're coming to here in Vidura's talk with Maitreya, and you also have the foundational understanding that you have a non-relationship with the material world, and you know there's somebody behind it who's trying to help you, then you can enter deeply within the process of hearing and pointing your attention towards the relishable topics of the spiritual world. Yat pada pankacha palasa vilasya bhakta karmashrayam gratitam udkritayanti santa. Tadvanda rikta matayo yatayo pirudha shotoganas tamaranam bhajavasudevam, which is mentioned that in the 4th canto of the Bhagavatam, that if you have developed an attraction for hearing the topics of Krishna, it's vilas, it's enjoyable, then you can cut this connection you have to the material world. Whereas if you're rikta matayo, your head is empty, then you'll naturally gravitate back to the 3 modes of material nature, because it seems like a good idea. Like, have you ever heard anybody say it seemed like a good idea at the time? And then how's that working out for you? Not very well. Karmashrayam gratitamukkratayanti santa. But the santas, those who become saintly by associating with others who are in Krishna consciousness, can develop this vilas, or attraction for Krishna in the spiritual world, seeing the deities, chanting Hare Krishna. And finally, just a concluding statement to the preface, or these introductory remarks is that the purpose of the creation ultimately is to give the living entities an opportunity to come out of this illusion. And Sankarsana, who is not intimately, but somehow indirectly connected with the creation of the material world, as mentioned in the 5th canto of the Bhagavatam, before he starts his destruction of the material world through the agency of Rudra, he becomes a little annoyed because he's given unlimited chances for the jivas in the material world to come back to their senses and come back to him. And then they say, oh no, I'm not interested. And it's in that sense of annoyance that the Rudras pop from his forehead and start their dance of destruction and burn down the material world. And then it starts over again, giving an opportunity for all living entities to come back to Godhead. So we can take from this many things, but 2 general things are that the material world's perfectly accommodating, and if we just adjust ourselves to Krishna's purpose, Shri Shri Radha Gokulananda Sita Ram Lakshman Hanuman Shri Shri Gornitai Ki Jai, Giriraj Maharaj Ki Jai, then just as every living being is being fully accommodated to try to enjoy the material world in exactly the way that that living entity wants to be accommodated, will be fully accommodated in the spiritual world. Even if our desire is minuscule, the Lord is waiting for that tiny desire even of the living entity to say, no, I would like to have you instead. If he's accommodated every living being to enjoy the material world in exactly the way he or she wants to, it makes sense that since his main purpose is for us to come back to him, that he would also accommodate our desire for devotional service. And the other lesson is that if you're engaged in missionary work, which means giving souls an opportunity to take the knowledge by which they can be reconnected with Krishna, then you're doing something that's extremely dear to Krishna, as he says in the Bhagavad Gita. No one's more dear to me than the person who engages in this activity. There's a rough and tumble sketch of a few thoughts from this verse and the section, and now if you're open for it and there's enough time, I don't know how long the class goes today. Is it finished? Half. Okay, so we have a few minutes for reflections. Anything you heard that you can repeat that you think would bring out an important aspect of the conversation, or a question that's highly relevant to the section of the Bhagavatam we're talking about and that would augment the conversation as well. And we give $100 for any bad question. 100 pounds, which I have right here. Yes, Prabhu.
Hare Krishna. One quick question, Ruji. So, when such topics come, topics about Mahat Tattva and interaction of material elements, etc., they are not so entertaining to hear. So, mind gives 1,000 reasons not to go and sit in the class. So, what do we do?
I didn't catch the last part of it. What was the question? Okay, try it again.
Yeah. So, when such topics come about Mahat Tattva, interaction of material elements, etc.
Got that.
They are not so entertaining to hear.
They're not so entertaining to hear.
So mind gives 100 reasons not to go and sit in such classes.
The mind gives 100 reasons not to.
So what do we do?
I don't know. I find it quite entertaining. Because I really find it entertaining. I mean, I'm sorry for those who don't. And I guess the antidote is to chant better rounds or something, but I find it so edifying to hear this knowledge. In fact, from the very beginning when I read Bhagavad Gita, before I had any association with devotees, I looked at the world in a different way. Because I heard about the three modes of material nature and what their symptoms were, just as a complete neophyte, I was able to walk around and say, oh yeah, that's the mode of ignorance, and there's the mode of passion, and there's a consequence for associating with that. That saved me from the way I was interacting, which was indiscriminately. I didn't know the difference between one thing and another, and what the consequence was. Anyarevahur sambhavad, anyarahur sambhavat, iti shushvamadiranam yenas tadvid shakshare. Sri Upanishad says the sages have sorted these things out for us and given us a clear distinction between that which is good for us and that which is bad for us. And one result is obtained by meditating on the supreme cause of all causes, and a different result, which isn't good, comes from meditating on that which is not supreme. And I find also that the ways that Krishna describes our interaction with Maya to be fascinating. For instance, he tells Brahma, Ratirtam yat pratyeta na pratyeta chatmani tadvidyada manomhayam yatabhaso yatatama. What is Maya anyway? Where is it? It's a very odd or amorphous or subtle energy because it's almost not there. You have the material nature. It's not in Maya because it's inert. It doesn't have anything. It has no consciousness. And we're also conscious beings. Asango hyayam purusha. We actually, says the Vedas, have nothing to do with the material nature, and we're fully conscious. So where's Maya? It's in a mistaken look at the material nature with the intention of enjoying separately from the Lord. Then, to facilitate that, the Lord creates a world in which we think we're looking at our own stuff. And Krishna mentions Jayato Vishayam Pumsam Sangasteshu Pajayate Sangat Sanjayate Kama Kama Krodho Pijayate. He says with that illusory context, if you look at the material world and think, oh, I can enjoy that, he said, there's a rabbit hole you're going to go down, and you're going to get caught by it. That all the mechanics of that can be very, very interesting, because we have the benefit of being in Maya. That's a good thing, or not. But the Ishamanishad says, Vidyam cha yas tad vedo bayam saha avidyayam ratum tirtva vidyayam ratum ashnate. Only one who can understand the knowledge and nescience side by side can receive the full blessings of immortality and attain liberation. So we're in it, and that's an ideal situation. We have a bird's eye view of how it works. We can read Bhagavad Gita and then be observant of how Maya works. For instance, you might notice that the attraction to other bodies is illusory, and it's one of the main points of the Bhagavatam, that there are forms, there are love affairs in the spiritual world, but when they're here in the perverted reflection of the material world, they don't work out so well because they're not substantial, they're not real. They lead us into attachment that becomes overwhelmingly troublesome. So I guess I'm saying I don't agree with your premise, that it's not interesting. We try to make it more interesting. Yes?
Hare Krishna Maharaj, thank you so much. I was thinking about this aspect of the Lord's universal form, where he says that the Bhagavatam says the most attractive or alluring illusory energy is Krishna's smile. And then later on it says when the Lord smiles, he shows his teeth, which are the jaws of death. So I was just wondering if you could relate this illusory attractive energy to...
Well, Prabhupada gives the example of the cat who picks up the kitten with its teeth, and the rat, when a cat picks it, well, let's make it a mouse. Nobody likes to hear about rats, right? But then a poor mouse gets eaten. It's a tough subject, but I'm going to have to go there. So the cat grabs a mouse in its teeth, and looks like a nice little kitty, but it later devours that little mouse. Whereas when there's the kitten, then the mother cat picks up the kitten in her teeth and very lovingly carries her to safety and takes care of her and licks her and stuff like that. So when we're bhaktas, in fact, the whole material creation is for the bhaktas. Paritranaya sadhunam vinashaya tuduskritam. Krishna really comes for the sadhus, for those who are devotees, to reclaim them and give them an opportunity to come back to him. So it really depends on our disposition. If we're in the mindset that I'm the king of the world, then we'll get really scared by Maya. Bhayam dvitya abhinibeshatasya ishad apetasya viparya yosmiti, says Haviyogendra, that there's a way in which when we have this perverse mentality that I'm a competitor of the Supreme Personality of Godhead, there is no God, or if there is, I'm Him, etc., then we become filled with fear because we see those teeth as death coming to devour us. And Mrityu sarva harash chaham, Krishna says in the Bhagavad Gita, Okay, if you weren't able to develop any kind of connection to me through knowledge, through work, through devotion, then I'll tell you what I'm going to do for you, little fella. I'll show up as death and scare the bejeepers out of you, like rah. And then, death is kind of a mighty form of the Lord that comes and says, wake up, little jiva. This is a real thing you're involved with. Well, it's an illusory thing you're involved with here in the material world, but it's highly consequential. And death can be very clarifying, right? Yeah. I was with my mom when she passed away. I had a really close relationship with her. She said something to me as a soul, not as my mother, before she passed. A few days before she passed, she said, I never want to have to do this again. I was like, what did you just say? Who was that? It was a soul inside the body of my so-called mother who said that. And death, Krishna comes according to our disposition as the mother cat and just pulls us out of the material world, or as all-devouring, fearsome death. One more question. Yes, Hare Krishna. We need a microphone in 7 seconds or less to Vishaka Devi, or your money back from today's class.
Thank you for the very enlightening class. In the verse, the false ego plus the mode of goodness creates the mind. And then elsewhere we learn that the false ego plus the mode of passion creates intelligence. Can you explain? Because one would think it would be the opposite.
The mind is, in its original state, is representative of the Mahatattva, which is in the mode of goodness. And the mind is neutral. But the intelligence is creative. Creation comes from Rajogun. From the Mahatattva, then comes the tiny influence of Rajogun, which then grows into, also descends into Tamagun due to the various ways in which the modes compete with one another. And the intelligence, because it's there to calculate, measure the material world, how long is it, how high is it, where am I going to set up my house, how am I going to have a family, how am I going to get elected as the governor of this state, and so forth, all goes on in the intelligence, so that's Rajogun. So that's the nature of those two entities. Nonetheless, when either of them, as Krishna describes at the end of the 3rd chapter of the Bhagavad Gita, as I referred to earlier, is purified, then they become the tools by which we can extricate ourselves from the material world. Sufficient? Okay. Vishwambar Prabhu, you have 30 seconds.
You mentioned the verse, Indriyani paranyahur, indriyabhya paran mana, manasastu para buddhir, yobuddhe paradastu sa. Indriyani paranyahur means, Lord Krishna says, the senses are above the ahur, the material energy. I was dwelling on that. The Virat Rupa, which is non-different from Lord Krishna, which is the powerful material energy, which dwells on every body, life, it appears to be much more powerful than our senses, also because it's Krishna himself. I've always found harder to understand how can our senses be superior to the material energy. Can you explain a little bit? Because also the Prabhupada said ultimately everything is spiritual.
Well, actually, in one of the commentaries in the Bhagavad Gita, it's described that the sense objects are considered above the senses, and in the vein of kamadinam katina katita palita durnidesha station jatamayina karunanatrapa nupashanti. There's a way in which the devotee recognizes at a certain point, after getting association, that I've been serving the bad masters of the senses because they've been inextricably connected to their objects, and they've been giving me a bad direction. So no more am I going to follow them. And the other reason is, as Krishna describes, Daivahi gunamayi mama maya duraya. Although in the hierarchy described by Krishna, Bhumir apo analovayu kamaro buddha evacha ahankara itya me bina prakritirashada, he says these are the lower energies. And then he says, apareya mitostonyam prakritim birimi param jiva bhuta mahabahoya yedam darite jagat. Above that is the superior energy of the soul. So how does the soul become overcome by the lower energy? Because it's daiva. We use our creative, our knowledge-gathering senses and our working senses to create something, for instance, in the material world, like a television, and it's just made out of wood and wire, right? And glass. But then it conquers us right back. And it's like, what happened to Dilip? Dilip's sitting there watching television for 7 hours a day, because he's captured by the creation that he thought that he was the king of, and now it's the king of him, and now it's the smartphone. So it's all Krishna's energy, and we are no match for it. The only way that we can become in harmony with the material nature, as you just alluded to, is when we use everything in Krishna's service and consider it his energy to be used in his service. Brahmanyadaya karamani sangam tyakva karotiya lipitena sapapena padma patramivambasa. If we see everything, all the material nature, our senses, to be used in Krishna's service, then we don't, Krishna says, become implicated by the power of the material nature or by our senses. Om. Yes, Maharaj, for the close.
Thank you so much. Just on this theme of hearing about Maya, we hear in the Bhagavatam, Shrinvatam Svakatha Krishna, that we should always hear about Krishna. But 2.753 of the Bhagavatam also says, Shrinvata Shradaya Nityam Maya Yatma Namuyati. That you should also constantly hear about, chant, remember Maya, but in relation to Krishna. And if you do constantly hear about Maya in relation to Krishna, then Maya Yatma Namuyati, then you'll never become bewildered by Maya.
Yeah, and I just thank you for bringing that up. So important. It closed an important gap here. And there's a way in which the Bhagavatam does that for us. Krishna says in the Gita, Vita Raga Bhaya Krodha. There's 3 psychological malconditions that we have to overcome in order to become rectified. And those 3 categories, raga, undue attachment to the material nature, bhaya, which means a fear of one's personal existence and a relationship with a personal God, and krodha, which means anger at so many competing ideas and confusion about the whole thing that you just become an atheist. And the Bhagavatam, very gently, through nested stories, takes us on a storybook tour and unravels every one of those and all the subcategories that come under them, so that we become free to hear about Krishna, and we have no more doubts about our non-relationship with the material world, and that we're eternally related to Krishna. So nitya nitya sambandha prakritischa paraivasa. We have an eternal kinship with the Lord. And one of my favorite verses, asango hyayam purushaha. Little jiva, nothing to see here. In fact, there's a sign in Mayapur when you walk into Srila Bhaktisiddhanta Saraswati Thakur's compound area. Before you get to his samadhi, you get off, in that rickshaw area, and you walk through. There's a little building there. I don't know what's in it, but there's a sign that says, "There's nothing to see here." My favorite sign. And I thought you could just put that up in the material world. Little jiva, there's nothing here for you, little fellow. Let's move on now. And then there's the 10th canto we can enter into, through which it becomes a solid fact that our relationship, Vikritam Raja Vadubiraham cha Vishnu Shradhanvitona Srinuyat Atavarnayad Yet. When we have that context, that Shraddha, we have nothing to do with the material world and Krishna is real, then when we hear about Krishna in the spiritual world, then we have nothing more to do with the material world, even if we're here still. We've checked out, except for our involvement for service here in the material world. Otherwise, nothing to see here. Thank you very much, everyone. I have to stop because I'm over time, right? It's 8:35. Dear Srila Prabhupada, dear Shri Chaitanya Mahaprabhu, Shri Shri Panchatattva, Shri Shri Gaunitai, Shri Shri Sita Ram Lakshman Hanuman, Shri Shri Radhagokulananda. If you so desire, please empower us to read all of Srila Prabhupada's books 100 times each before we scroll next on our phones. Please give us compassion for all the people of the UK who think it's okay to throw garbage in the street and drive on. Please let us go door to door, shop to shop, use every aspect of the internet to introduce people to the beautiful form of Lord Krishna and the Srimad and all of Srila Prabhupada's books. And please let us be kind friends to all living beings, starting with all our God brothers, God sisters, and brethren within the devotional community. Thank you for considering our request. Om Tat Sat.